Hello, my name is Miss Linnea Lark, and I've been an art teacher for over a decade, and today I'm going to teach you how to use wax resist to make unique designs on your pottery.
It's all about your posture.
Before I start any creative projects, I like to organize my thoughts and brainstorm connections between ideas in order to develop intentional concepts in my work. Using my brainstorming sheet, I plan my challenge, write about my feelings, and declare a concept. I like to know what my emotions are and what's driving my work. I also like to list adjectives and any other words that I connect to my concept and ideas. A color theme is always important to relay my emotions, and I always list a bevy of images that I can use for symbolism. Once everything's listed and I connect to everything I want to use, I move on to composing my images. Before I begin transferring my image, I paint my Bisque pot with 3 layers of white Amaco lead-free Lug underglaze. I mostly use velvet underglazes, but I have found that the white Lug underglaze is less patchy than the white velvet underglaze. It is absolutely essential that you do 3 layers, and that you wait for each layer to dry properly before applying the next layer. If you apply layers on top of wet layers, you will remove as much underglaze as you are applying, which will result in patchy application. Once I've got a drawing that I like, I'll cut it out and make sure that the images fit the desired places. I like to use carbon paper to apply my images. Make sure the dark side of your carbon paper is facing your pot so that the image transfers. I use washi tape to secure the image to the carbon paper. Now I'll hold my image in place while I trace my lines with a colored ballpoint pen. I like to use a colored ballpoint pen so that I can easily tell which lines I've already traced and I don't miss any lines. The carbon paper will leave a light halo of the image. I then go back with a pencil and refine the lines, making them darker. I will also have to tweak the image because the roundness of my pot will warp the image as I was unable to trace it onto a flat surface. I use a small piece of mattress foam to safely keep my pot from rolling as I apply Wax On Resist. Wax On Resist is the best brand of wax I've ever used. This was my first time using it. It is a wax made by potters for potters, and the manufacturers have solved many of the problems and annoyances that are involved when using wax. One of the most annoying things about using wax is that wax is impossible to remove. If you make mistakes you cannot live with, you'll have to refire your piece to remove the wax. There is no other way. The pink tint makes the wax easy to see and helps prevent mistakes. It dries in about 20 minutes instead of having to let your pot dry overnight. You can get right back to work relatively easy. My favorite enhancement of this wax is that it easily washes out of brushes and doesn't leave a disgusting mess behind. For reals. It also has a hard edge that doesn't lift when you sponge it off. The wax repels glazes or underglazes. By applying wax on a color, white in this case, you are protecting the areas covered in wax from future coats of glazes or underglazes of other colors. Once the wax sets up in about 20 minutes, you can brush over it with another color and the wax will repel the glaze or underglaze. While the wax repels, it will still leave little beads of color behind. It's best to sponge those away as soon as possible. I was hoping this new fancy wax would repel a little bit better than some other waxes that I've used before. But I got a similar effect of beading and tinting that were impossible to fully remove on such a small pattern. After this trial, I think wax is best used for large designs if you want to have crisp and consistent colors. When applying underglaze on top of wax, the repelled liquid will bead up on top of the wax and leave the area tinted with whatever color that is applied on top. It is best to use a sponge as soon as possible to relieve the beading and tinting that can permanently stain the piece. However, my pattern was so fine and precise that it was difficult for me to get a sponge in there. The tinting and beading leaves behind a neat rustic antique look that would be desirable on a less busy design. But I knew instantly that wax was not the optimal technique for such a precise and small pattern. The tinting and beading made a busy design even more distracting. When I moved on to the bunnies, I applied the pink underglaze with more precision, avoiding the wax areas instead of painting over them. The wax of the snake skeleton inside the green bunny was very fine, and so I went right over top of the skeleton with the green underglaze. Some tinting and beading remained visible, but it didn't bother me on the skeleton like it did on the black and white pattern. Notice how I'm always marking my wheel where I started a layer. This helps me get consistent coverage, making sure that I don't leave parts out or double apply in others. I also make a mark after each layer so I don't lose track of how many layers I've made while I'm talking and helping students. Now that 3 coats of each colored underglaze is applied, I can put it back in the kiln. Since I only had wax and underglaze on my pot at this point, I was able to put it back in a bisque firing since that's what I needed to fire for my students anyway. I was less than thrilled with the tinting, beading, and imprecision of the wax that I applied in the black and white patterned area. I was also shocked to see that the areas where wax was applied over graphite, there was a light red-orange line left behind. I was afraid these lines wouldn't go away since they had already been through a firing, so I decided to straighten out my lines and apply 3 more coats of white and 2 more coats of black to straighten out those edges. When trying to apply straight edges to a shape, I start in the middle of the shape and carefully inch toward the edges. Once I barely kiss the edge, I write it as long as the angle of my brush is able to glide smoothly with the edge. When the angle I am holding the brush at gets awkward to move, I'll pull the brush back toward the middle of that shape before releasing pressure. This helps keep the edges crisp and smooth. Once they came out of the kiln again, the edges were much crisper. The red lines I covered were gone, but were still visible on the skeletons near the edges.
I think the first thing you need to know about hip-hop, it's all about your posture.
Now it's time to apply the glazes in order to make this piece water and dust proof. I used Laguna's low fire pink blush on the inside. I poured the glaze inside and then carefully tipped the pot so that the pink blush would just barely kiss the edge of the inside of the pot, and I rotated it so that all sides would have equal coverage. I now quickly and carefully dump the glaze back into the tub, sponging off any drips, and I touch up the irregular edges on the inside of the pot. When pouring or dipping glazes, you only need to do 1 coat, as glazes apply thicker when they're being poured or dipped. On to the outside. I'm using Amaco's low fire lead-free matte glaze. I love this clear glaze because it actually looks more satin than matte. It isn't crazy reflective, so it's easy to see the design beneath it, but it is also very silky smooth. There are 3 major hang-ups when using clear matte glaze. The first hang-up is that it gets really thick. This glaze tends to thicken up very easily, and so I'm always adding water to keep it the consistency of runny school glue. The second hang-up is that the matte glaze has a lot of grit inside of it. These pieces of grit can be very visible when fired. Here you'll see me straining it through a damp, clean rag, but I also have to pick out all the little bitty pebbles every time I add a layer. The third hang-up is that clear matte glaze, when applied too thick, fires milky. Corners tend to have thicker buildup, and can look white instead of clear, and so it is important when you're applying it to carved pieces or to pots with tight corners to suck out any extra glaze from the edges and corners. If you don't have the patience to deal with these hang-ups, use clear gloss glaze instead. It's very temperate and easy to use, even if it is a little bit more shiny. All that's left to do is to put it through the last glaze firing. And here it is, out of the last firing. I'm actually pretty pleased with the results, especially after having so many frustrating setbacks and fixes to make. The even better news is that all the red lines disappeared in the last glaze firing. I'm not sure if that's because of the glaze or because it was a faster firing. If you know, please comment below. I'd love to figure it out. When you're facing similar difficulties, remember to take notice of the mistakes you've made and learn some lessons that will help you the next time around. This time I learned that wax is not the tool to use for small precision. When using wax, it's best to have a loose design where beading and tinting can look natural. Before I go, I just wanted to show a color comparison of the underglaze colors and how they change throughout the process. When hand mixing my colors, such as the pink and green colors shown here, I always remind myself that by the time it gets through a glaze firing, the colors will become significantly brighter and darker. I try to err on the side of too light when mixing and avoid dark colors where details can become hard to see. And so that's the end of this wax tutorial. I hope you've learned a lot from my work and from my mistakes. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to my channel. I would love to read some of your tips about wax resist or any comments about your experiences, whether it's positive or negative. Good luck with your pots and happy day!